Okay, today we're going to talk about what I've learned about dopamine because it's something that's very interesting and I think it's very valuable to know how it works. And credit to Dr. Huberman because his podcast is very educational and I've learned a lot from him. And I would recommend you checking out his channel. Just go on YouTube, search Huberman Lab because that's where I've gotten most of my information. And ever since I started implementing it in my personal life, honestly, it's been amazing. So check his channel out. And yeah, without further ado, let's start explaining my experience and what I have learned with about dopamine. First, just a general description of what dopamine is. Dopamine is a neuromodulator that releases chemicals in our brain, and these chemicals are responsible for what makes us feel good, basically. So, basically, when you think about what is enjoyable, let's just say watching movies, eating specific kinds of food that you enjoy, having a certain drink, partying, talking to people that you like, and all etc. Playing sports and shit, working out. All of these things, depending on how you view them, release dopamine because it is something that you like. So if it's something that is positive and something that your brain sees as, oh, okay, I actually like doing this and it makes me feel good, your brain starts to release these chemicals. So when you release these chemicals, your brain starts to modulate the different kinds of dopamine it likes to release with certain activities throughout everything that you like doing. Okay, so yeah, that's the basic definition of what I've learned about dopamine and just the basic works of it. Moving on, dopamine definitely ties into addiction. And quoting Andrew Huberman from this, I would say addiction is the narrowing of what brings you pleasure. So when you're addicted to a certain activity, I don't know whatever it is that you're addicted to, but if you know that you are addicted to something, it's basically narrowing that dopamine range. So your brain is just trained to release dopamine from that one specific activity, and it's not able to release as much dopamine from all other things. It's only prefers dopamine from that one thing, right? Okay, so your brain is now trained to release very short gaps of dopamine because when you're addicted to something, one particular thing, whether it's food or a certain habit, your brain releases a high amount of dopamine, and this ties into the concept of dopamine baseline. Think about your dopamine baseline as a pool of dopamine. So basically, your brain uses this pool, this baseline, to release a certain amount of dopamine depending on how much you enjoy a certain action. So when you perform an activity that is highly stimulating, your brain releases dopamine in a very large fashion. So it takes a big, just think about when you splash in a pool, right? A lot of water tends to rise from it and it just spills back out. So when you do this certain habit that you're addicted to, right? Your brain releases this dopamine, but it's also extracting the chemicals, right, from this pool of dopamine. And after you extract the chemicals, the amount of dopamine you have does not remain the same. So this ties into my next explanation. That is, when you do an addictive activity, your dopamine rises, but when the effect of pleasure stops, your dopamine drops below baseline. So basically, that's the explanation of when the pool of certain amount of chemicals from your dopamine pool, after the feeling of pleasure your dopamine drops below baseline. So you don't have as much dopamine as you had before you did that activity. So that's why when your dopamine drops below your baseline, you then trigger this desire for more, because you know how it feels like after you do something that you really enjoy, but you know it's kind of bad for you, you feel like shit. That's because that feeling of pleasure made your pool of dopamine drop below its original baseline. So when you keep doing these activity, your baseline keeps going lower and lower and lower because you keep releasing dopamine from that original pool that actually depletes your original dopamine. So that's why we always feel like shit when we do the things that we like doing that we know are actually bad. So yeah, try my recommendation to you is to try to leverage this as much as you can by avoiding the bad habits. I know that's easier said than done, but try to modulate how much dopamine you release throughout the day, because every little thing that we like doing that's enjoyable, it takes a certain amount from our original pool of dopamine that we wake up with every day. And the more we release the dopamine, the more we extract from that original pool that we have. And the lower that original pool becomes, the worse we feel, because our dopamine is dropping below baseline. So yeah, basically that's the dynamic of your habits and the how dopamine works. So that's my basic understanding of that. This is something I'm also trying to do at the moment, but if you want to try to obtain a healthier baseline, basically trying to increase the quantity of the pool of dopamine that we have, so that sorry about that, bro. So that when we do extract dopamine from this pool, we have a bigger pool, so that we don't feel as bad after doing some habits. But it doesn't mean that you should keep doing the bad habits that you like doing. Try to stop those so that you limit that addiction factor. It will definitely help you if you try to limit those highly addictive activities, because it's still not good for you. One thing you should, like what I mentioned before in one of my previous videos, your sleep is very important, because if you sleep well, you always wake up with a healthy pool of dopamine, and as you keep trying to increase that dopamine pool with your sleep, you feel better each day because you have a higher baseline. This increases baseline. Your nutrition, working out is one thing that can increase your dopamine, and it definitely has for me, because working out, you go to the gym, right? Let's just say you're about to do a hard leg workout. It's very hard, right? You're feeling uncomfortable. But instead of starting by increasing the dopamine above baseline, you're decreasing your dopamine in that moment. And the steeper the decrease in dopamine, so the more, if you feel a lot of pain in the moment while you're doing a certain habit, the quicker your dopamine will rise back to baseline level, and it will actually go above your baseline level, which is always a good thing, because it'll always make you feel better when your dopamine rises above baseline. So it's the same thing, like I said before, when you do the addictive habit, the steeper the increase in dopamine, the deeper it'll drop below, so the worse you feel. So the more pain you experience in that moment, let's just say while you're working out, the more your dopamine will actually rise above baseline. So yeah, I hope that I explained that pretty well, and you understand a bit about the dopamine and how to kind of leverage that as best you can. Another thing I would want to discuss, just one more thing, is try not to spike your dopamine before effort. So let's just say you studying for exams or you have a paper to write or something. Stop doing dopamine spiking activities before you do hard work, because as you do hard work after you spike your dopamine, like I said before, it'll start to drop as you're doing that work. So try to leverage dopamine by not releasing too much of it before you work hard, because if you spike your dopamine too much before you work hard, the worse the hard work will feel. So I would say try your best to stay in a neutral state. So as you stay in a neutral state, you're not too hyperactive, or you're not too like depressed during the day. You're just chilling. You're just at a normal level. So do your best to leverage those things. And one thing I would just say to you is try to avoid the bad habits that increase your dopamine too much, which will lead to your dopamine dropping below baseline.